Welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. This week we've been exploring the various ethical issues that arise in human subjects research contexts. And on Wednesday, hopefully, you watched the documentary highlighting a modern example of bioethics failures in human subjects research. Now, this is simply one of many case studies that have prompted bioethicists to question whether or not informed consent is enough to protect participants in these contexts. So, class today will be as follows. We were going to explore one question: what makes a clinical trial ethical? And I want to apologize about my voice. I've been dealing with a respiratory issue, and so I might sound a little harsher, and I might cough. But I assure you, I'm fine. And so, yeah. So please excuse the gravelly sound, so to speak, in my voice. So we're going to explore this question: what makes a clinical trial ethical? And we're going to be utilizing the Real Stories documentary, When a Drug Trial Goes Wrong, Emergency at a Hospital, as a touchstone for our deliberation and discussion. So I asked you to watch this documentary this week for several reasons. And so in the documentary, it was a first in person trial, or a first in man, although I prefer first in person trial, where a drug was being tested to see if it was safe for human consumption. You initially do that before subsequent trials are done to determine appropriate dosage, etc. And so this had catastrophic impacts to the handful of people who were human subjects for that particular trial. And so here are some questions that you can discuss on the discussion forum. What ethical concerns does this trial raise? Was informed consent obtained? As you saw in the beginning, the participants did sign the informed consent document, but does it meet the strict criteria for informed consent? Now, the inquiry ruled that the trial was ethical. Do you agree or not? Ethical, how so? Or did it simply follow the current regulations and policies? So it was legal, but was it ethical? And what ethical standards should be in place beyond this? This particular trial, the Elephant Man case, prompted the European Union to rethink their requirements for human subjects research. And so, do you think that certain changes should be made? And if so, with which changes in order to protect human subjects in the future? And so I'm very much excited to hear what you all think about this case. This case garnered a lot of discussion in the bioethics sphere, and so there are many moving parts to it, and there's quite a bit to discuss. So, are clinical trials ethical? And why are we discussing this? Well, the overarching objective of clinical research, as we talked about earlier this week, is to develop generalizable knowledge to improve health, improve standards of care, or obtain information that can help improve standards of care in the future. But unlike in purely medical contexts, where medical professionals are dedicated to improving the health of patients to the best of their ability, in human subjects research, people are placed in harm's way because we simply do not know. We're developing new standards of care. We're obtaining new information to help improve medicine. And so, with all of these questions and with all of this uncertainty, human subjects are placed in contexts where they could potentially be harmed. So we're placing some people at risk of harm for the benefit of others and for the benefit of society. And so this is why human subjects research has been a sensitive topic and an important topic in bioethics because it has the potential for there's a potential for exploitation of human subjects, as we saw. And we talked about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and we discussed the Kellogg experiment where orphans were fed nuclear or radioactive material in their breakfast cereal. That actually occurred. And these are just two examples. A third one being the Stanford prison experiments, where undergraduate students were utilized for research purposes and were not allowed to leave the research context even when they requested to do so, due to being put in a very dangerous situation. And so the Kellogg case, the Stanford prison experiments, and Tuskegee are just three examples of many of where human subjects were exploited in various ways to obtain um, information. And so there's a tension there, right? We need to, or we want to develop clinical practices and standards of care to help patients in the future. But human subjects are placed in a context where they can be harmed. And so, how do we ensure that human subjects are protected to the best of our ability during this process, and that their autonomy is respected throughout, and that we're benefiting if we can, and we're not doing harm, following the four bioethical principles? And so, Emmanuel et al. In their piece, they argue, well, we do have guidelines in place. When we engage with the question, what makes clinical research ethical, we need to recognize that we have been grappling with the ethical nature of doing human subjects research. And we've already developed guidelines, and these are very important. And so, just to pull from them, as we talked about in the beginning of this class, we have the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki. These form the foundation for the Belmont Report and for the four principles of biomedical ethics. And these come out of concerns that human subjects need to be protected. We have the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Say that 5 times fast. That is a mouthful, but it also provides clear-cut recommendations and policies and regulations. The foundation for policies and regulations to protect human subjects. We have the Belmont Report coming out of the 1970s, which was developed because of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and the outcry due to the unethical nature of this experiment. And so we have Beecham and Childress arguing that we have 4 principles: the principle of autonomy, the principle of non-maleficence, do no harm, one of the oldest principles in medicine, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice. And these need to guide our behavior in medical contexts and in research contexts. And so all of these various documents and codes, the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the National Commission, and the Belmont Report, create frameworks that help guide human subjects research to ensure that it is indeed ethical. But Emmanuel et al. Are not impressed. They are concerned that these codes are not doing the heavy lifting, that they're not doing enough to protect human subjects. And so they want to expand the protections, but I'm getting ahead of myself because this is actually one of my favorite pieces. So these codes are not enough to ensure that a clinical trial is ethical. Why? Why so? We've had 50, 60, 70 years of these codes doing a lot of heavy lifting in medical research contexts. Fast forward to 2020, and Emmanuel et al. Are arguing that there's a gap in the literature, that we're still not doing enough, but they haven't justified it yet. So why are they making this claim? Well, they argue there's a clear problem with the guidelines. Many of these documents were written as a response to specific events and to avoid future scandals. And as such, they are oddly specific in certain ways and oddly general in other ways. And so, due to the focus on instigating events, the guidelines tend to emphasize certain issues, but they downplay others that are equally important. And so they go on to be like, well, let's look at these codes. Okay, so we have the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code came out of the Nuremberg trials, the famous trials that took to task the various doctors who committed atrocities during World War II. And so, as we saw with the Nuremberg Code, informed consent, respect for autonomy, and the choices of people, the people involved, was first and foremost, because consent was never given, never respected. And so that's at the top of the list. And we talked about that in the first week of class when we looked at the history of bioethics and how again and again in the Nuremberg Code, it might be very long, but informed consent played a major role in several of the recommendations. Favorable risk and benefits. The risk should be outweighed by benefits. And if it is a very risky procedure with little benefit to the individual or society, then that should not be performed. And there was no mention, though, of just subject selection. But the Belmont Report, on the other hand, which was developed as a response to Tuskegee and Willowbrook, yes, it also included informed consent and favorable risks and benefits, but also included a heavy emphasis on the protection of vulnerable populations. And so just subject selection was prioritized and is prioritized in the Belmont Report. And subsequent regulations that guide U.S. human subjects research. So, for example, when we were looking at the COVID vaccine trials, just subject selection played a major role in the choice of who contributes and does not contribute to these trials, who is selected to be a part of these trials. And that is a relic of a very important component, but it's also a relic of the Belmont Report itself and the origins of the Belmont Report. And then we have the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, and this code doesn't discuss risk-benefit ratios at all. And so there's no worry, or at least no concern, that the potential benefits of a study, because remember, human subjects research is risky precisely because we do not know ultimately what is going to happen. So there's uncertainty. But both the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Report argue that, well, we should at least surmise that, or we should at least be cognizant that the benefits of a study should ultimately outweigh the risks. And if it's a very risky research project with very little probability of being beneficial, then it shouldn't be done, because human subjects are shouldering the risk of being a part of a trial. And so at the very least, that risk should be for a purpose, right? A greater good to serve society, etc. And so the documents show for Emmanuel et al. That informed consent is important, but it's not enough to ensure that research is ethical. because different guidelines focus on different components. And so, yes, informed consent is prioritized in the Nuremberg Code, in the Belmont Report, etc. There are these other criteria that informed consent is wedded to, or at least the respect of autonomy is wedded to, in order to ensure that human subjects research is ethical, be that just subject selection, or be that risk benefit ratios, etc. And so the fact that these different codes and regulations prioritize different components or different criteria, and that these criteria show up in some but do not show up in others, for Emanuel et al. Is confusing for researchers and the Internal Review Board, or IRBs, alike. And so, what we need then is we need a standard list that can be applied to all research in order to provide a unified code that IRBs can draw from and that researchers can draw from, with clear-cut ethical considerations uh, that don't fluctuate depending on which code and regulatory structure we're looking at. So we need a universal ethical framework. And so we need one that is universally applicable, that helps professionals determine whether specific clinical research studies are ethical. And so Emanuel et al., they're looking through all of these various codes and regulatory structures that have these priorities based upon specific unethical human subject research projects. And all of these ethical considerations are important, but they should be equally applicable no matter the context. And so they provided the ethical 7, so to speak, 7 criteria that should be applied to human subjects research to ensure that it is ethical. And they argue that this provides both a systematic and a comprehensive framework. And these are, and most importantly, as we see, they're not deviating from the Nuremberg Code and from the Belmont Report in doubling down on respect for autonomy and informed consent, because informed consent is number 1 on their list. They're like, yes, informed consent is necessary for human subjects research to be ethical, but it is not the only thing that is necessary, as we'll see. Then social or scientific value. So epistemology and scientific methodology comes into play and has a normative component, which I find particularly interesting, as we'll talk about. So we have informed consent, social or scientific value of the particular study, scientific validity, again, of the study, fair subject selection, justice comes into play. So again, pulling from both the Nuremberg and the Belmont Report, favorable risk-benefit scenarios, so making this standard, not to be included in some regulatory structures, but not included in others. No, favorable risk-benefit scenarios, that should be a part of our comprehensive framework. An independent review and respect for subjects. So these are the ethical 7 to help guard against ethical failures in human subjects research, such as the quote elephant man case that we saw, or that we're discussing this week. So let's unpack these a bit. Social or scientific value, what do they mean by this? So they argue to be ethical, clinical research must be valuable. So what does this mean? To be ethical, clinical research must be valuable. And so here they are muddying, well, not muddying the well, but they are opening up the distinction between scientific work, between epistemological work, between methodologies, and the objectivity of science, and the normative context, where we argue or discuss whether or not things should or should not be the case. And when it comes to the context of human subjects research, the value of that research comes into play. So, it means one of the following. The trial evaluates a diagnostic or therapeutic intervention that could lead to health improvements. And so here, just to use this as an example to explain that it must have social or scientific value, that because human subjects, in some cases, are placing their lives on the line in order to advance the medical sciences, that the particular study should have value. If the study has value, then human subjects are placing themselves at risk for no benefit. And this, for Emmanuel et al., is unacceptable and renders a trial unethical. And so in this way, there are three different ways that they argue that a medical research project could have value. And so here's how one fits in. The trial evaluates a diagnostic or therapeutic intervention that could lead to health improvements. It is a primary study to develop such an intervention. So we're improving a standard of care, or we're forming the foundation to improve a standard of care. Or it tests a hypothesis that will provide important knowledge about the structure or function of human biological systems, which will also improve standards of care and medicine moving forward. And so these are three examples of how a particular trial could have social or scientific value. Now, they do argue that this list could be increased, but right off the bat, we should be weighing whether or not it's worthwhile. Should we be placing people's lives on the line and having them shoulder risk? And is the study necessary, or is it not? Now, connectedly, if you have decided that a trial has social or scientific value, because individuals are placing themselves at risk to obtain this information, Emmanuel et al. Argue that the value of studies with trifling hypotheses or that do not produce new knowledge need to be called in question. And they make an argument that I find fascinating, and I'm curious if you agree or not, especially because this bucks the trend in current medical research. So they argue that because people are placing their lives on the line in some situations in order to obtain medical knowledge, that it shouldn't be hidden behind a paywall, that it shouldn't be protected by these pharmaceutical giants or for-profit biotech companies or whatnot, that society has a right to access this information. So they go on to argue only if society will gain knowledge, which requires sharing results, can exposing human subjects to the risk in clinical research be justified. This is a very strong claim that Emmanuel et al. Make in the middle of a long paper, because it pushes back on current practices in the United States and globally. So if human subjects are involved in clinical trials, they argue, then that information should not be hidden away. It should not be protected, but That information, the information gleaned from that clinical trial, is the property of the scientific community and various other communities as well. So, do you agree with this statement? This is another area that we can discuss in the discussion forums because pharmaceutical giants would be pushing back against this. Whereas we're at a Research One institution, and so I could see many of our researchers here being on board with this. We're a community facing institution. We, as a land grant institution, do research for the benefit of Washingtonians and beyond. And so, where do you stand on this particular criteria? And do you agree that if it is behind a paywall, then it's not ethical? Because that in itself is another very strong claim. Scientific validity, and this is connected to the social and scientific value. To be ethical, they continue, research must be conducted in a methodologically rigorous manner. And so, excuse me, with the cost of knowledge being so high when human subjects are involved, the methods and methodologies need to be pristine because scientifically unsound research on human subjects is unethical because it exposes subjects to risks for no purpose. We can't use the information. We can't duplicate or replicate the study. We can't use it as the basis for developing a new standard of care. It's unsound. It's invalid. And so it will need to be redone. And as such, human subjects have been placed in a context where they're shouldering risk for no benefit whatsoever. And in this way, again, that line between doing good science and following an ethical code for Emmanuel et al. Blur when we're talking about human subjects research. Third, fair subject selection. Justice should be and have a primary place in any code involving human subjects research. So what does it mean for subject selection to be fair? Well, subject selection encompasses decisions about who will be included and excluded in the study, the strategy for recruiting subjects, and which communities will be study sites, etc. Fair subject selection played a major role, as I said earlier, in questions concerning COVID vaccine testing. And so each of these components of subject selection, who will be excluded and included, your recruiting strategies and communities, should be equitable. And so they go on to argue that the scientific goals of the study should be the primary basis for determining the groups that will be recruited and enrolled, simply because a particular group of subjects or demographic is it's easier for you to recruit them does not make them the ideal group for your study. And I'm thinking about the various projects at R1 institutions. There are many students available who could potentially be a part of the studies going on at WSU or other places. Yet, researchers should ask themselves, are students the correct demographic for some of the research? Now, in addition, vulnerable groups, convenient populations, groups that don't benefit from the study should not be included. And so, when possible, those who will best benefit from the study should be included in the study itself. So we have fair subject selection. There should be a favorable risk-benefit ratio. And remember, this was included in certain regulatory structures, but not included in others. And Emmanuel et al. Are arguing no. Favorable risk-benefit ratios should be a standard rule of thumb that's applied to all clinical research, irrespective of context. So, research inherently entails uncertainty about the degree of risk and benefits because we have limited knowledge of the therapeutic intervention. But we need to take steps to limit risks. And so there are three conditions, right? Potential risks to individuals must be minimized when possible. Potential benefits to individuals should be enhanced. And the potential benefits to society should outweigh the risks. And so we could, for example, have a research project where we're testing out a cure for baldness. But if potential risks associated from of this treatment include potential organ failure, then this is a problematic risk-benefit ratio, and so this particular clinical trial should most likely not be done. Well, it should not be done because the risk of potential organ failure outweighs any benefits of regrowing a full head of hair in this situation. And so risk benefit ratios should be included as an ethical feature when talking about human subjects research. Now, it should also undergo independent review. And so this isn't to say that researchers are inherently biased. It's just that researchers have multiple legitimate interests. They're researchers. You want to conduct high quality research. You want to ensure that your work is scientifically valid and sound. And so that's an excellent sort of commitment to have. You want to protect research subjects. You want to obtain funding so that you can continue doing the thing that you hopefully love, which is to do research. You want to train graduate students, the researchers of the future. You want to advance your careers and move up the research and academic ladder, depending on where you're doing research. But all of these could include unintended conflicts of interest. And so an independent review for Emmanuel et al. Just ensures that, excuse me, I'm just going to cough, my bad. My apologies again. Just ensures that you are not smuggling in a bias that you don't recognize, or the researcher isn't smuggling in a bias that isn't recognized, that could potentially impact the structure of the clinical trial, the choice of subjects, or any other element of the clinical trial itself. So it's just best practice. It's good to have another set of eyes on the clinical trial setup and justification and methodology, etc., to ensure that there are no potential biases in any of this, in this context, or unintended conflicts of interest. Now, in addition, and this sort of circles back to autonomy and informed consent, we need to respect enrolled subjects. And so in many, well, at least previously, respect for individuals in the clinical trials ended when the clinical trial is finished. Human subjects provide informed consent. They are part of the trial. The trial ends. Researchers go on with the data and the results, and they decide what to do with those results. And so the human subjects are no longer a part of that process. But for Emmanuel et al., we should, because human subjects are placing themselves at risk, we need to respect them even when the research itself ends. And so, first, it doesn't end when the subject signed the consent form. And so individuals need to be treated with respect during and after the research has ended. And this entails 5 different activities, as we'll see. First, privacy needs to be respected. As we talked about almost ad nauseum, privacy is very important in medical context. And it is the flip side or other side of the coin of respecting autonomy. And it also is connected to the other principles too, such as not harming your patient, because information can be harmful. Um, Information leaks, etc. And remember, James Rachels argued that respecting privacy respects the patient's choice to disseminate information when and how they see fit to protect their own social relationships. So, privacy must be respected. Subjects need to be able to change their mind. They can withdraw from or remove themselves from a study or clinical trial at any time. And so, in the Stanford prison experiments that utilized students at Stanford, the students were not allowed to withdraw or remove themselves from the study. So that's a huge issue. So once you sign that informed consent form, we still, or researchers still, need to respect the choices of the patient beyond that. So subjects can change their mind at any time. Any new information that is gained about risks and benefits need to be shared. If, say, you're seeing an uptick in risks and health impacts, that information needs to be shared with the human subject. The welfare of subjects needs to be monitored at all times. So, in the case of the Elephant Man case, they were monitoring the patients, but did they stop administering in time, or did they just continue going? So, if they experience adverse reactions, they need to receive treatment or be removed from the study. And they need to be informed of what has been learned from the study afterward. So, the study is over. Let's say researcher A developed a new standard of care. The human subjects involved in that study should be apprised of the results and benefits that this study gleaned, that the researchers gleaned. And so these are 5 different yet very important ways of respecting the autonomy of patients. I keep on saying patients, but of human subjects in research contexts. And so, we're not going to talk about placebos because we discussed those earlier. I will post the COVID-19 vaccine development because it does bring up questions concerning just selection of participants, as well as whether or not we should be utilizing challenge trials, which have an increased amount of risks. But I'm going to leave you here because I think we're already pretty far along in this lecture. It's getting a bit long. Thank you again for dealing with my voice. I apologize about that. I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about Emanuel et al.'s 7 criteria to ensure that human subjects research is ethical. If these were in place, do you think the Elephant Man trial would have occurred, or that the gentleman involved in that first in human study would have been harmed? Are Emanuel et al. Going far enough? Do they indeed succeed in creating a comprehensive framework that can ensure that all human subjects research is ethical? Are they missing anything? Or do you think it's unnecessary and that the Belmont report and the Declaration of Helsinki or various other regulations, regulatory structures or codes are already doing the majority of the heavy lifting, and that we don't need these further protections. So I'm interested to hear what you think concerning the Emmanuel et al. Piece, and whether or not these criteria indeed are needed. So thank you all very much. Looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that you have a great week. Take care.